Hey everyone, and welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Nicholas Albert, and in this episode we're going to be discussing ISO in astrophotography. For any of you that follow along with my podcast, you know that I just put an episode out about this a few weeks back. So this is going to be the visual reference, the visual guide to that podcast episode, so you can follow along and test your cameras out and do the ISO test that I discussed on the podcast episode. If you haven't checked out the podcast, it's called Crafting Light. Go ahead and check it out. It's on all major streaming platforms. It's a great podcast. I really enjoy putting out the episodes every 2 weeks, and we discuss a lot of great stuff on there. So go ahead, check it out, and follow along for new episodes every 2 weeks. Now, this video is going to be all about the same concept, ISO and astrophotography, and I want to explain ISO and how it works in a brief high-level overview so that before we get too far into this, you understand why we're doing this and the effect that ISO has on your images, the quality of your images, and the overall image-making process. So, back in the day of film cameras, when we would go ahead and buy a specific film with a specific ISO sensitivity setting, we knew that we were going to be shooting all of our images at that specific ISO sensitivity. Where now in the digital age, you can just push a button and change the ISO settings on the camera. However, it does not work the same way as it did with film. In film, ISO and sensitivity went hand in hand. It was a chemical process that basically, as the light came through the lens and landed on the film, the chemicals would react with the light and in turn produce an image. Whereas in digital photography, the light is coming through the lens and landing on an electronic sensor in the back of the camera. So film still has that sensitivity settings as far as the ISO setting of the film itself goes. Whereas when we're increasing the ISO in a digital camera or using a digital camera, we're not actually changing its sensitivity. We're actually changing the gain or the amplification of the signal coming into the camera itself. So basically, the light that comes through the lens and lands on that sensor is all collecting, and as we change our ISO setting, we're literally just amplifying that light and that signal as it's coming through. We're not physically changing the sensitivity of the camera, we're just amplifying the signal that it's receiving. And signal is a very important thing to understand when we're discussing ISO, because signal is the good data that you want to be capturing when you're out shooting low light images, astrophotography images, anything like that. Signal is always the good data, and noise is the data that we want to avoid. And the more we increase our ISO, the more grain and noise we're going to introduce to the image, because we're actually just amplifying the signal. And once we tip the scales and amplify it too far, our image quality is going to degrade rapidly, and ultimately we're going to end up with unusable shots. So we want to avoid that. And the way we avoid that is by taking into consideration something called a signal to noise ratio. And basically what that means is that we want to get a good amount of signal or good data into the camera while keeping the noise very low. One thing to keep in mind is that noise is actually caused by the electrical imperfections of the camera itself and the way that the electronics in the camera process the data and save it to our memory card. It's going through the processors, it's going through the electronic sensor, so the more we turn up the gain or amplification, the more noise we're going to be getting. But there is a way to determine that perfect ISO setting that allows your camera to get a good amount of signal while keeping the noise very low, and there's a way to test for it as well. And that's called an ISO invariance test, and it's something that I'm sure a lot of you have probably heard of, or at least come across if you're getting into astrophotography, or maybe you've been in astrophotography for some time. Basically, ISO invariance means that a camera can produce the same quality image at its base ISO as it would at, say, ISO 64 by simply increasing the exposure in post-processing to match effectively that that same ISO. So think about it as taking an image at ISO 100 in the darkness and then just going back into post-processing and increasing the exposure by 5 stops and having an exact identical copy of that image at ISO 6400. They'd basically look identical to each other and you wouldn't be able to discern between the two. Now, that's something that just simply doesn't exist in its most pure form. There is no such thing as a perfectly ISO invariant camera. However, there are cameras that can perform to a degree in that kind of ISO performance. So what an ISO invariance test does is it essentially tests the camera at different ISO settings, and it allows you to determine A, if your camera is in fact ISO invariant, and B, if it's not ISO invariant, what the best ISO settings are, where you're going to be getting the best signal to noise ratio in your images, and ultimately allowing you to produce the best quality images while using a camera in very dark scenes or for astrophotography. So for this video, I've gone ahead and I've chosen my Z6 II and my Z7 II. I'm going to be using both of these cameras out in the field. I'm going to take and set them up and guide you guys through every step along the way so you can follow along with your camera and we can learn all about ISO settings and ISO invariance together. Now keep in mind, a good ISO setting for my Z6 II may not be the same as my Z7 II. Every camera is going to be different and there is no perfect ISO setting. So for however many different bodies you own, you very well may have to test each one if they're different bodies so you can find that ideal ISO setting. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to pack up all my stuff, we're going to get my stuff in the bag here, we're going to head out tonight, we're going to take a few shots to test this ISO invariance, see which one of these cameras is ISO invariant, if either of them are at all. And again, I'll be walking you guys through the steps from start to finish so you can follow along with your cameras as well and do the same thing. Let's go ahead and head out and get this started. All right, guys, so I'm outside. I'm actually just in my backyard. You really don't have to go anywhere extravagant for this. You're really just looking for an area that has some features in it. I've actually chosen a couple pine trees here. The moon is up behind them. It's a very cloudy night, just really not good for astrophotography at all, but good enough to do an ISO invariance test. I have this Nikon Z7 II set up here. I've got my little camera set up back here so I can try to show you guys what's happening as I change the settings. A few things that you need to do when you're out setting up your camera and shooting a ISO invariance test. The first thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to have your camera set to manual mode. The reason being is because you don't want any of the settings to change as you're going through and changing your ISO. The only thing that should be changing as you do this is your ISO itself. So I have my camera set to manual. The next thing you're going to want to do is have your camera set to RAW. The reason being is because we need to be able to adjust the exposure when we get into post-processing to do this correctly. And if you're shooting JPEG, you're not going to be able to do that. And I mean, to a degree, yes, you can, but it's just going to destroy the image. So shooting in RAW is essential. Once you have all that set up, you basically just want to choose settings that you want to make your base settings. So in this instance, I'm using f2.8 with a 2-second exposure at ISO 100. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to take my first shot. I have my first image, and then I'm just going to go and move forward in full f-stops. So from ISO 100, I'm going to go to ISO 200. I'm going to take another shot without changing the exposure time or the f-stop value. And then from 200, I'll go to 400 and do the same thing. And we're going to do this all the way up to 6400. So once you're at 400, you increase again to 800. And then we will increase one more full stop to 1600. And then finally, we're going to increase one more full stop to 3200. and the last set of images will be at 6400. Now once you have this set of images, all you got to do is go back into post-processing and basically bring the images together and compare them side by side. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do the same exact thing with the Z6 II, and then we'll go inside and we'll take a look at these and do the side-by-side comparisons. So I am back at the computer. I have all the images loaded up in their respective files, and I've made this template here that is a free download. It is in the description of the video, so if you want to follow along with your camera, or if you want to perform the same test on your camera, you can go ahead and you can download this template, which once put together will look like this. This is the result of the Z6 II image test. You can see that I have a slight color shift here at ISO 100, but I'm thinking that this is more of a white balance problem. Regardless, I feel like the location could have been better in performing this test, but ultimately, for lack of time and there being a ton of clouds, I'm pretty satisfied with the end results. Now, for those of you following along, you can do this in Lightroom or Bridge using Camera Raw, whichever method you prefer. You're more than welcome to go ahead and follow along using your preferred method. Again, this is the template. It is a free download in the description of the video. If you want to follow along, go ahead and download that and bring your images into either editing platform of your choice, and we'll go forward from there. Now we're going to jump into the Z7 II files, and you'll see that I've already gone ahead and I've labeled them ISO 100, 200, 400, and all the way through up to 6400. Now I'm going to click the first and the last and select all the images, and I'm just going to simply right click and hit open in Camera Raw. Now that the images have opened up, you'll see that all of them look fairly equal to one another. That's because I've already gone ahead with these and unified the exposure. And what I mean by that is I've gone through them and I've adjusted the exposure settings by their respective values. So ISO 100 needs to be adjusted by 5 stops. ISO 200 needs to be adjusted by 4 stops. ISO 400 is adjusted by 3 stops. ISO 800 is adjusted by 2. ISO 1600 is adjusted by 1 stop. ISO 3200 is not adjusted at all. And finally, ISO 6400 is actually reduced by 1 stop. And you want to do this because, again, we're trying to unify that exposure between all these images. So as we're going through and doing this, make sure that you are adjusting the exposure slider only by the respective amount that they should be adjusted. Again, ISO 100 is 5 stops, 200 is 4, 400 is 3, 800 is 2, 1600 is 1. The ISO 3200 shot does not get adjusted, and the ISO 6400 shot is reduced by 1 stop. The next thing we're going to want to do is select the very first image and then select all images. You can either hold Shift and click the last one, or Control or Command A will select them all. And if you want to place these into the template that I've provided, we're going to want to crop these images. So we're going to go ahead and hit the crop button here. And the number down here, the 8256, we want to go ahead and get this as close as possible to 864 so that we can go ahead and get that image into the template. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to bring these in, and with all images selected, you can see that the crop is being applied to every image. Now I'm going to tighten this up until I get as close as possible to that 864. It doesn't have to be perfect, but try to get as close as you can just for getting it into the template. 862 will work, and you can see that in having all the images selected, it has applied that crop to every image here in the film strip at the bottom. So I'm just going to go back over and click the Edit tab up top, and now I have every image cropped and set to their respective exposure values and the same exact crop, so I can put these images side by side and look to see which image is going to perform best in a side-by-side comparison. So now we got to get them into the template. To do that, we're going to come over here and we're going to click the drop down next to open. We're going to hit open as object, and this is going to open the images in Photoshop as a smart object. And basically all we're going to do is go ahead and drag and drop them into the ISO invariance test template that I've put together. And from there, we can go ahead and compare them all side by side. For those of you that are following along at home, you can go ahead and follow these exact same steps. You'll see up here, since we've already labeled the files, we know which ones are which. So we'll come over here to ISO 100. We're going to just click and drag and drop it right into the template here. And we're going to do that for each image. All right. Now, once we have all of the images placed in the file here, what we can do, if you want to get it perfectly even and perfectly matched to each one of the images you've dragged in, all you have to do is select them all by just clicking and dragging across them all. You'll see that all of them are selected. And then you can come over here and click this button here, auto align vertical centers. And then if you click this little drop down and hit the distribute horizontal centers, it will make all of the images even. And there you have it. We now have our full ISO invariance test of the Z7 II ready to dive in and look at. So what we're really looking for here is just wanting to zoom in and look to see which ISO we're getting an incredible amount of noise at. And really, if the camera is ISO invariant, there shouldn't be much of a difference between ISO 100 and ISO 6400. And looking at the two images, you can see that there is a slight difference. It's not extreme, but for the most part, they are almost identical. It looks like the ISO 100 image, when boosted by 5 stops, actually ended up with a bit more grain than the ISO 6400 image did. And looking here in the middle, I actually think that the ISO 800 image has a very good balance of noise and signal coming into the image there. You can see here that on the ISO 400 image, it's still a little bit grainy, and the ISO 1600 image still has some slight grain to it as well, but the ISO 800 image does look fairly decent. Ultimately, I really can't tell any major differences between all of the images. Just as with the Z6 II, you can really tell that there aren't any major differences between the images besides the white balance shift over here on this one. They're all really just about the same as far as quality goes and the noise in the image. One thing that I'm really looking for here is I'm looking at these lights compared to the darker background, and you can really kind of get an idea and kind of gauge how much noise is in the image in looking at these two areas of the shot. Now again, because of the location not necessarily being the best location because of this artificial light, the test very likely is a little swayed because there isn't really a lot of shadows in the image except for up here in these trees. But as you can see, the wind was blowing around the branches and it was causing a bit of mayhem out there for me while I was trying to capture a sequence of shots. Now, looking at all of this, I would say that the Z6 II is fairly ISO invariant, as is the Z7 II. I do think that this test has shown me that the Z6 II is definitely a better low light performer than the Z7 II, but I think that's something we all already knew. Both sets of images were shot at f2.8 at 2-second exposures with just a variance of ISO across each exposure. And again, looking at these two, you can really see the Z6 II images are brighter, while the Z7 II images are a bit darker, but really I can't tell an extreme difference between any of the images. I would suggest going with ISO 800, again with the Z7 II. If you look at ISO 100 and compare it to 6400, again, I do feel that there's a bit more grain over here on the ISO 100 image because we've boosted it so much. The ISO 6400 image does look slightly better than the boosted 100 image. But that is it. That is how you perform an ISO invariance test. That's how you find your ideal ISO. In this case, I think that the Z7 II performs well at ISO 800, but again, any one of these ISOs is clearly usable. It's definitely doable and definitely something that you could easily use and get a quality image with, regardless of the choice that you've made in ISO setting. As with the Z6 II, again, minus this goofy little white balance shift that I've got going on over here, all of the images look fairly uniform and really look just about the same. I do notice that on the ISO 100 and 200 image, actually all the way up to about 800 here, that the light on this light pole looks very uniform. It looks very clean. Over here, I see that the image has kind of lightened that light pole up a bit, so that might be something to watch for as far as highlights go. But overall, it looks like the Z6 II is fairly ISO invariant, as is the Z7 II, and that the best setting for the Z7 II would be approximately ISO 800. If you're following along with your camera at home, go ahead, try the same thing, and post your results. Let's see what you got, and if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the comments below. All right, everybody, that is a wrap for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like and subscribe to keep up with all the videos that will be coming in the future. I'm going to be taking a lot of trips and bringing you guys along for the adventure with me. We'll be talking a lot more about astrophotography, doing a lot of astrophotography adventures, and just all around really living into astro landscape photography and just getting out there and enjoying the night sky, enjoying landscapes and everything that they have to offer. Thank you very much again for watching. Like, subscribe. I'll see you on the next one. Take care, everybody.